I'm kind of excited to present on teaching observational learning to children with autism. Brooke had asked me to present, or I had the list of things and asked me if I could do one of the first two. And I thought, sure, but I don't know what I can prepare in time. So I've decided to just read a few of my method sections from recently published articles. For about 7 years now, I've been doing research on observational learning with children with autism specifically. And really the important area of it for me has been in that it's a skill that leads to learning. So in addition to probably learning a bunch of skills through observation of others, it's one of a few behaviors where once you acquire that skill, you can learn a lot of other behaviors. So think about learning to read as a similar skill. Once we learn to read, we can read for all sorts of information about different things. Learn how to cook, learn how to operate certain equipment. Observational learning is similar in that once you learn how to observe others and the consequences for their behavior, you can learn a myriad of things in the environment. From basic observational learning theory, really more with typically developing individuals, we know that, or we define it as somebody acquiring a new behavior or learning to perform previously acquired behaviors under novel scenarios by watching others. So they're going to watch others and they're going to see both the modeled behavior and the consequence for those behaviors, and they're either going to perform a behavior that's completely new in their repertoire that they haven't performed before, or a behavior that they've performed before but under different circumstances, so they're going to engage in that behavior under completely new environmental events. A couple of important terms that I'll put out there. One is the idea of matched responding. So it's a slightly different idea than imitation. Sometimes when we talk about observational learning, we want to say that the response matches or matches the model, as opposed to the model being imitated, because the model doesn't necessarily have to be imitated. I'll get into more of that later. And then the other term is vicarious reinforcement, and this is the idea that perhaps the behavior can occur without ever being reinforced itself. So we see something happen one time and we see the consequence for that behavior occur to somebody else. We then engage in that behavior because it's beneficial for us to do so. That process is described as vicarious reinforcement, even though we've never experienced the reinforcer for that behavior. So what is learned through observation? Several studies have shown that generally speaking, behavior occurs if good things happen after that behavior, and it doesn't occur if neutral or bad things happen after that behavior. So the consequences become really, really important. This is in Bandura's original description of observational learning. It goes back before that to more developmental and operant paradigms of observational learning, and in some cases imitation. So the big idea is just something good happens, we're likely to match the model. If something good doesn't happen or something bad happens, we're less likely to match the model. We know that for children, this is an incredibly important skill because they learn so much from the time they're about 10 months on through observation of others, be it through social interactions, educational environments. They learn functional skills. And we also know that it's this kind of pathway to no-trial learning. And what I mean by no trial goes back to the idea of vicarious reinforcement. My favorite example is if I'm on a city bus and I've been riding like these really new fancy buses that you push a button when you want the bus to stop. But one day when you want the bus to stop, there is no button. You get on and there's no button next to you. And so immediately you're distressed because you know you're going to miss your stop and have to walk or figure out something else. So you start watching to figure out what other people do, and you see that other people pull this really old ratty looking cable at the top of the bus, and then the bus stops and they get off. And you realize that you can do the same thing. It's just a different bus, okay? So we can learn without ever having to go through maybe a process of guided instruction or make an error in our learning. But for kids with autism, we have a big problem, and they're at a huge disadvantage in learning through observation because often they have deficits in attending to relevant stimuli. So they may not attend to what other people on the bus are doing in the first place. They may not have noticed that there is no push button, so they may not even be looking when they get on the bus for that button. They have deficits in delayed matching, so this idea of imitation at a delay or matching the response of a model at a period later in time. So it might not even be immediate. A lot of the things we learn through observation, we perform those behaviors later on. And also, many of the responses or many of the consequences for, that are reinforced, or many of the reinforcing consequences for behaviors are social in nature. So we engage in a social interaction, we get attention, we have fun, something exciting happens with another person, and because kids with autism demonstrate kind of idiosyncrasies in whether or not social interaction functions as a reinforcer, we may run into a lot of problems with them learning to learn through observation of others. Nevertheless, it's a really important repertoire to teach. For one thing, kids can't learn everything they have to learn in a one-to-one structured kind of classic discrete child type environment. There's both financial and time constraints, and what we've learned is that when kids do learn a lot of the skills they need in a one-to-one structured teaching environment, they don't really learn them in the right way, and then they don't perform them under a range of diverse controls later on. So with different social partners in different social environments, and more importantly, how on earth can inclusive education be effective if kids can't learn through observation? Given what happens in a typical classroom where maybe one person gets an opportunity to respond to the teacher every few minutes, it's really important that kids with autism who need lots and lots and lots of opportunities to respond are learning by watching what others do. One important distinction to make is the idea of observational learning as both an independent and dependent variable. So I've been talking about it much more as a dependent variable. Oh, that's not supposed to be up there yet. It was hidden away so you couldn't see it. I had to change at the last minute to Keynote because PowerPoint wasn't working right. So we'll see what happens along the way. Observational learning as an independent variable is something like modeling or video modeling, which is what I'll talk a lot about today. So it's really much more of an intervention. We're trying to teach a specific skill, social interaction, how to operate something that they need to change or adjust or do, interact with stimuli in the environment. When the skills acquired, we assume that observational learning has occurred. And for reasons that I'll get to in a little bit, we don't know for sure that observational learning has occurred, but we would infer it based on their behavior. Versus observational learning as a dependent variable, which is far more exciting but harder to figure out good research designs for. And this is where if a child didn't have this repertoire in the first place, we would develop a protocol that would teach them to learn through observation of others. So you could imagine that then the kid gets on the bus and knows how to pull a cord just by watching other people do it. Or they're in a classroom and they see a child raise his hand and get called on, and then he can ask his question. So the child with autism now learns to raise his hand before he has a question. What's tricky is we have to first identify that kids can't learn through observation of others, and then figure out a way to teach them to learn through observation of others, all the while measuring this in a real live setting. So that's kind of somewhat difficult. And we also have to, if we really want to show that observational learning occurred, we have to somehow systematically show both the occurrence of it and the non-occurrence of it, because this idea of response suppression is a big part of it. If I see somebody, the only thing coming to mind is like really grim examples. So if I see somebody start to cross a street and a car is coming fast and leans on the horn, and they jump back very carefully, I'm less likely, hopefully, at that point to start to cross the street until the sign turns to "Don't walk." If I see somebody pull a chair out over to a counter and climb up on the chair to get onto the counter to get up to a cookie jar, and while they're climbing they fall down, and I then stop climbing on the counter, that's kind of an example of observed observational learning or response suppression through observation of behavior and consequences. The really hard part is capturing the first instance. That is kind of the challenge we run into. So by definition, it's only learning if it happens the first time. Well, at least learning through observation, because after the first time, now the behavior has been exposed to direct consequences too. So now we don't really know what controlled it, observation or the direct consequences. So this is tricky for observational learning as an independent variable, because we have to just ensure that the children don't have the skills in their repertoire, and then we teach them, which is tricky but not really a big deal. For observational learning as a dependent variable, it's extremely difficult, especially for a controlled experimental design, because now you have to ensure that there is no observational learning at all in this individual's repertoire, or if it does occur, it's in a very, very limited and restricted way. One other important distinction is just that between imitation and observational learning. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. So the big idea is that there are some differences between imitation and behavior that looks like imitation but is actually under control of consequences, observed consequences. And that's the biggest idea, is that when kids learn through observation, or when people learn through observation of others, them performing the behavior should be under control of the observed consequence. And with imitation, we don't see that at all. We see a trial where we tell a child do this, and then they do the same thing. Or we're playing with them in a more natural way, and we engage in some behavior, banging on a drum, and then they copy that same behavior, banging on a drum. But the consequences themselves don't have a clear impact on the behavior. So generally speaking, the overall purpose of the line of research is to try and teach kids with autism new skills using observational learning strategies. So that's the observational learning as an independent variable. Pretty easy. That's just applied research, no big deal. We can do that. Series of studies on that. Can we also show that children with ASD engage in observational learning? So this would mean that if we looked at their behavior under one set of conditions where consequences were favorable for the model, the child performs behavior. If we look at the same kids under another set of conditions where consequences aren't favorable to the model, do they suppress the behavior? So then we get into observational learning as a dependent variable. Still a little harder, but doable. We then wanted to also look at whether or not we could identify conditions under which an observational learning intervention, which we've looked at video modeling, promotes matched responding. And in this case, we started getting into observational learning both as a dependent and independent variable. And eventually, we'd really like to look at this question of whether or not we can teach an observational learning repertoire among children with ASD who don't demonstrate that when they start. So one last little bit of jargon to clean up before getting into the experiments. It's blocked. So the skill that we've used throughout in experiments is demand, and it just comes from verbal behavior. Think of it as a request. It's really, really similar. The big idea is that when a demand occurs, it happens because of a state of deprivation or satiation. So we either want to get access to something, or we want to get something away from us and have it removed. And the distinction between a request and a demand was important, just because a request could occur, technically, a request has nothing to do with our environmental states of deprivation or satiation. It just, we could ask for things left and right that aren't controlled by those motivated variables. So demand is altered by motivation, really, is how we want to think about it. It's perfect, though, for observational learning experiments, because when we ask for something or when we demand for something, we typically get that thing. And if we're putting the effort in to ask for it, it's likely that we want it. So we could assume that these are our preferred consequences that an individual is getting. So once we know what a kid with autism prefers, we can now create a whole bunch of observational learning environments or experiments that involve getting what they want. So the demand was really useful for looking at that. And the first study really was an accident. It involved observational learning as both independent and dependent variable, and we weren't really trying to figure out observational learning at this point. Instead, we were trying to look at we had these kids with autism who were relatively non-vocal, so very few requests for anything. They engaged in problem behavior at times, but they also engaged in really subtle kind of gestures as well. And so the first step was to look at those gestures and say, do those gestures have the same function as problem behavior? So if we treat them like their requests, similar to how you would in functional communication training, can we actually respond to those in a way that would meet the child's needs and get them what they want, and then they don't have to engage in problem behaviors? And so we developed a video modeling protocol to test for this. But because at the time I was really interested in this idea of whether or not the gestures functioned as mands, I wanted to kind of present a counterfactual, which was that if we just try and teach the kid to request something without looking at motivation to do so, would they follow the video model? So, whoops, I'm going to come back to that. So the way this basically looked was first picking a gesture for a child and identifying what they might do that looked like a command or a request, and then going from there. So this is like a baseline session. So pretty clear. He's putting something in my hand. He wants me to operate it. I mean, that doesn't require a behavior analyst to figure out at all. And most of the time, you could do what he wanted in that lower level gesture, and then you wouldn't see any of the problem behavior. But the issue is that eventually this becomes a problem for kids because somebody doesn't understand what they're asking for, or what they're asking for is too complex, or they want something really subtle with the item. In this case, he just wanted me to wind up a toy, so along the table. But other times the kids might want adults to do something very, very explicit with the toy, or they might want another child to do something with the toy and the child has no idea. So we do want to look at addressing it in some way. So we showed a video model that looked just like this. Oops. Yeah. So a girl serves as a model. We filmed it with like the first generation iPhone, so that's why it's really grainy and funny looking. It's the kid's teacher, and we show him this video model. And then we give him a chance. Oh, you want help? Here we go. So that's observational learning as an independent variable. We show you a video of a behavior that leads to a preferred consequence, and we hope then that you're more likely to engage in that behavior. Oh, and then the important part, though, is then looking at a separate condition where we show you a video model, and it doesn't lead to a preferred consequence. It leads to a different consequence, and we see what you do. So this is just the same girl engaging with trains and saying, come play to her teacher, and her teacher comes over and they play trains together. And there's some mumbling, but nothing that approximates come play, probably because I'm boring. And that basically is what the two different conditions look like. And again, this is just by accident, but I'm seeing this, and after kind of going through the experiment with several kids, we start to realize that there's kind of interesting things. Oh, that's a bummer. You never want to see your data blocked by talking Design Studio 8. So these are just the data for that first participant, and the circles, the shaded circles, indicate number of trials during which demand occurred following an observed preferred consequence. And then the triangles indicate number of trials demand occurred following a neutral consequence, so come play. And essentially, it didn't happen at all for this kid across these two word pairings. And the difference between the Series 1 and Series 2 is really what we're looking for in terms of an effect. So same kid, we put new word pairings in place, we get the same outcomes. A new set of word pairings and a similar set of outcomes. So over and over and over again, generally seeing that, that these responses are occurring when the child sees preferred or observes preferred consequences. They don't occur without the same preferred consequences. Oh, you want the balloon? Here, bud. Have the balloon.
Open this. Yeah, I know. That's yeah. Oh, you want me to help you go up the white balloon? I can do that.
So the goal is learn the skills. We get rid of the video. You've acquired the skills now. That really doesn't have that much to do with observational learning, but it's a cool part of the study, so I wanted to show it. Second kid, same thing. Similar outcomes, but for this kid, what was interesting is for him, I think this is a better example of observational learning because he had vocalizations in his repertoire, but no words. There were no requests, no words. There was just occasional screaming. So we took one of the sounds that came out when he was screaming, which sounded a little bit like, oh, and we started picking mans that were similar to that. So here's the first example with him.
Oh,
so he just sees a little girl actually using the same container, really cute little girl. I'll show you later. There's movies of her and her sister. They're adorable. So he sees her asking for someone to open a container, and then he picks up the container, comes over to me and says, oh, which was about the best he could do. But again, so for observational learning to occur, we want to know, can he actually acquire novel behaviors? So O probably is in his repertoire, so we want to build on that.
open.
So a closer approximation. And now we're getting true observational learning. He's watching the video, learning new skills or how to use, I mean, presumably the ability to move his tongue in a certain way and have noise come from his vocal cords. I'm sure if a speech communication disorders person heard me talking like this, they would correct it. I don't know the correct terminology for it, but all of like the requisite skills are there. Everything is there. He just has to produce them in a logical way. A third participant, I won't get too far into individual data on that, but generally the kids acquire mans when they view a video depicting behavior followed by known preferred consequences, and they don't when the video model doesn't. Pretty basic, obvious implication that we have to pay attention to the modeled consequence. The other thing, though, that was important that came out of this is even though the observational learning component was an accident, the depiction of this response-consequence relation became really important because now we have a behavior that's helpful for observational learning, which is demand, and we have this this modeled sequence that's really helpful because it shows not just the behavior but also the consequence for that behavior. And what's nice even still, so now we've also done some experiments of just pretty random behaviors. I'll show some of that. But what's nice about this is when we think about using it in a more natural setting, this is exactly the kind of behavior we would think about occurring, is something like asking people for something. So then the question is, can we teach new skills using observational learning? So can kids learn to engage in new behaviors? It's really, observational learning is an independent variable, so much more of an applied study than any kind of demonstration of learning theory at all. And where we found it was valuable is that as we kept working with young kids with autism, obviously they have most of the kids we worked with had pretty severe deficits in language. And so the question that came up was, can we improve on the current training protocol for these kids? Because typically what happens when we teach kids to request is we give them a vocal model. So they are playing in some environment, and there's a toy on a high shelf and they want it, and we're not going to tell them, or we're not going to give it to them, but we can see that they want it because they're engaging in those gestures that would suggest they want it by reaching for it, looking at us. things along those lines. And we might give them the word for the item, like bus. And then they say, oh, bus, yeah. And we get the bus down and they get it. Us giving them the model for it isn't really observational learning. It's much more of an imitation scenario. We want them to vocally imitate. And although it might be effective, kids can become really dependent on the prompt. And then the demand isn't used in a variety of settings. So it becomes really problematic. And the temporal sequence, we've argued, is really what the problem is, because it doesn't utilize an observational approach. It uses an imitation-based approach. So we contrive this motivating event, and then we give the prompt that the kid asks for the item or demands for the item, and then the same person who gives the prompt delivers the item. But think about this in natural scenarios with kids. So my 3.5-year-old walks around asking for things all of the time. The person she asks for something from gives her that item. In the event that she doesn't know what to say, we can tell her kind of what to say, and she'll do it. But imagine an alternative where I might be able to kind of pull her aside and give her some coaching about how to go ask mom for something she really wants. And I say, remember to use the word please, because mom's much more likely to do it if you say please. So, give it a practice. How would you say it? And she says, oh, okay, can I please have more to eat? Right, good. Now go try it. She walks over and she tries it and she says, Mom, can I please have more to eat? Mom says, oh, sure, what a nice way to ask for something, and gives her something else to eat, and she gets reinforcement. In that case, it's a different person. The person who prompts is not the person who delivers the reinforcement. And that can be important because in the naturally occurring environment, prompts, they don't occur. They aren't delivered. For kids with autism, they need to be, but that doesn't transfer real well to the natural environment. So we've used video modeling as an alternative to this, and we can show that sequence that I just talked about, and it turns out that changes the temporal event. So now the prompt comes first, or the video is shown first. And then the environment, there's a motivating event in the environment. The child can ask for something, and they get the reinforcer. So this approximates how it should look in real settings, rather than a separate person prompting it. It separates out the listener from the prompter. So just what I just said on the same slide. Cool. So in this case, we really wanted to look at a comparison of traditional training procedures and video-based training procedures. And what this starts to get at is whether or not these videos work better than kind of this previously used imitative sequence to teach commands to kids. So we had 4 kids, none of whom had very good speech. In fact, 3 we weren't getting any speech from, vocalizations but not clear speech. 1 imitated vocal interactions. We wanted to look at prompted and independent mands, and there's obviously some specific definitions for those. It kind of just covered that. We also wanted to look, though, more longitudinally at both acquired and mastered mands. So over the course of several months, rather than just a few weeks of training some mands, we wanted to look at when they actually acquired it. So the first time they emitted the mand without a prompt at all, and then also once they mastered it, so once they met mastery criteria. We paired mands together based on preference and ease of pronunciation, so this is what they looked like for different kids. And then we started teaching. We'll see how the visuals work for this. So here's the first sequence, and remember, we're going to contrive the motivation first, provide a prompt, and then provide a reinforcement.
Where is it?
It occurs to me in watching that I should have, whoops, stop. I should have mentioned that the way we contrive the motivation for it is we take these highly preferred items, and they're always in the same spot. So anytime she finishes one task, we say, all right, good job, you can get your toys out. And she goes to get her toys out, and they're suddenly not there. So she just should create motivation to say, where'd they go? Where'd you put them? Where are they? And we try and prompt it, and nothing occurs. We then, kind of the counter condition or the comparison condition is to train it with video.
I have a surprise for you.
I have a surprise. What is it?
It's actually, we just got our twin. No, they were twins. It's legitimate video. So showing the model first potentially helps depict the sequence under which behavior should occur. I won't go too far into the design on this, but generally what was really interesting is here's what we saw for these kids. So blue is this traditional condition where we're giving a model prompt or its imitation. Red is the video-based condition. And generally you don't see a huge difference in the MANs acquired. So this is the number of MANs each kid met acquisition criteria for. So they engaged in the MAN a certain number of times. I can't remember anymore what the criteria was. But even though video-based training it is higher, it's not substantially higher. And for one kid, actually, they acquired more MANs in the traditional condition. But when we went to mastery, we saw a much bigger difference for kids. And for all kids, they acquired MANs under video conditions more. When we looked at the results as a group, similar, I mean, it's really the same data, just presented as a group. Acquired MANs, you see the separation at about week 9, where they're starting to acquire more in the video-based training condition, but the number mastered was substantially higher. So think about this as being able to fade out prompts completely, and kids continuously ask for those things under different conditions with different people. So again, the video-based condition is helpful for that. Why is it helpful? We don't know. Really. We're trying to work on figuring that out now. But again, I go back to what it depicts, and it's not just a modeled behavior, but it's a modeled contingency. So they see everything, the antecedent behavior and the consequence. So I'm not going to get too far into implications from that one, because I know some of the time is ideal to spend in discussion instead of me talking. We took this idea of the importance of observed consequences. So now we wanted to explicitly manipulate these observed consequences and see what would happen. We knew previously that kids involved in video modeling studies would demonstrate differences in how they responded to the video, and we had seen it from studies we had done previously, but we had never meant to see it. We weren't trying to show differences in performance based on observed consequences. So now we really wanted to try and figure that out and replicate previous findings. So we basically asked a question about manipulation of target behaviors and corresponding environmental events. So we have 2 different behaviors, and those behaviors are highly similar, but they lead to different outcomes. And then we want to know if children with autism match the model responding when the model is rewarded versus when the model is punished. And punished is a real technical term. I don't mean it in terms of like electric shock, but more in terms of you'll see one condition, the model gets to join a preferred activity in progress. In another condition, the model has to share a preferred activity. So I'm thinking of sharing as a punishing consequence here, because I know if I have to share something, I'm much less likely to engage in behaviors that led to sharing. So we have 3 children. The whole session is delivered in an early childhood program by a speech-language therapist. And we're measuring initiations directed toward peers. And the initiations are identical across 2 conditions. They have to approach a peer, and they have to invite a kid to play. They engage in a verbal initiation, either inviting a child to play or asking to play with a child. And that's the only difference. So, hi, can I play versus hi, do you want to play? That's it. We show all the video models on an Apple iPad. So now we're back to video models across both conditions. In one, they simply ask if they can join. And then they contact their preferred materials with a peer. In another condition, they see the model, and then they have to invite a peer to play. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And we use a reversal design to show first that neither was happening in baseline, and then they occurred in one and not another. So here's what asking to join would look like. And then here's what invite to play would look like. So we have to give up one of our items. Amy gets mad at me because these are like the only home videos we actually have. It's terrible. So I'm going to try and get videos that aren't involved in research studies in any way, shape, or form. Hold on. We're going to move our graph. Oh, I can't because it's in the slideshow. So if you look at participants 2 and 3. They generally depict the data overall for all of them. In baseline, there's no responding. In the sharing condition, then, when they're giving something up, we see nothing. Nothing emerges. The experiment was actually designed not to test observational learning. It was designed to teach social skills to preschoolers. But it turned out none of them like to share, which I think is the case for all preschool kids. But then when we showed them videos of asking to join, we're seeing it over and over and over again. So we go back to this sharing condition and say, okay, maybe now that they've learned to follow the video, maybe now they'll share. Turned out they wouldn't. They're just not giving up this item. But again, we go back to joining and they do. What was really interesting, or my favorite thing about it, was that these kids with autism who have pretty serious skill deficits in many areas, they actually have an observational learning repertoire. We just accidentally discovered this. So every time we reverse the behavior, they perform the response. And they suppress the response too when non-preferred consequences are depicted. So it's not just performance of the behavior that leads to preferred consequence, it's response suppression as well. And then the first trial responding was consistent with what we would predict. And by first trial responding, I mean these initial sessions across every phase change. Whoops. So in the phase change to joining, we found that 2 of the kids, that indicate those are averaged responses, but in both cases, they performed the very first trial when joining was displayed. And then the response is suppressed by all kids in the first session of sharing. So it's really the video and the observed consequences that have control over behavior. Because if it weren't, then we would expect something to have happened because they just finished a condition where responding was really high for all the kids in the final session of joining. And then we see no response. So the last thing then that we've tried to figure out is we had this issue in that study of the behaviors are slightly different. So if we make the behaviors identical, they're always identical, what are the effects then of manipulating observed consequences? So this gets even farther into observational learning as a dependent variable. And essentially it's a useless study except for the fact that we might learn something about observational learning. There's nothing really applied about it. Going back to the idea of observational learning, behaviors followed by observed consequences are more likely to occur. Neutral or non-preferred consequences make behavior less likely to occur. But there is a problem with this, and that's that there's this history of direct reinforcement, and that's going to impact responding. So after the first time you do it and you get reinforced, we don't know if you're responding because you've been reinforced or not or because of what you observed. So that poses a slight problem. But we would expect that to fade over time because if you've gotten direct reinforcement for something and then you see it again, you're likely to respond. But if you see something and you see reinforcement occur and you don't get reinforced, you're not likely to respond. So let me give a good example of that. If I'm at snack and I raise my hand and say, can I have some Teddy Grahams? And I get the Teddy Grahams and Billy sees me get the Teddy Grahams. And then he raises his hand and asks for Teddy Grahams and the teacher says, I'm sorry, we're all out. He can't get his Teddy Grahams and he's kind of upset. But that's an example of where observational learning has occurred. He's asked for those Teddy Grahams. He can't get them because now we have a new history, direct reinforcement impacting what actually happens. So he's less likely to now ask for Teddy Grahams, or he should be. And you can see where for kids with autism, they actually continue to ask for the same thing over and over and over again. So we know that there's a difficulty here with this condition of direct reinforcement. So we wanted to know, do kids with autism respond in a similar manner? So again, 3 kids, it's always 3 kids. I don't know why. We've tried for more, but it ends up being 3. all videos depicted on an iPad. Now we've got 3 behaviors that really have nothing to do with social interactions. We just want them to stomp their feet when we tell them to stomp their feet, clap their hands when we tell them to clap their hands, and touch their ears when we tell them to touch their ears. That's it. They observe the video models do the same thing. In one condition, video modeling only, the observed consequence, there is none. It just fades out to black. And then they get nothing for it either. They're just hanging out, touching their ears, stomping their feet, etc. In another condition, the model gets rewarded. I call it vicarious reinforcement here because the model obtains the preferred item, but the child gets nothing. So if they do it, they get nothing. We would expect eventually behavior to go down in these first 2 conditions. If it starts out happening, we would expect it goes away. In this third condition, video modeling with both vicarious and direct reinforcement, model obtains the preferred item, and then we expect the child to obtain then the child obtains the item contingent on matched responding. So this is like the good condition where we would expect behavior to occur and to stay strong over time. I just said those things. So, all right, this one we're going to exit out of we'll move the graph here. So here are the data, and we ended up with 2 phases. And the reason why is because in this first phase, none of the kids performed like we would expect. All of the data series were overlapping, and essentially they couldn't figure out the difference between when the model was getting rewarded, when they would get rewarded, and when the model wasn't getting rewarded, what would happen for them. So they're just imitating constantly, trying to get the item, or they're suppressing responding completely because it's inefficient. Interestingly, we started seeing problem behaviors in the observed reinforcement condition. So they see somebody else get the item, they then engage in the behavior, they don't get the item, and they engage in problem behavior after that. Which, I mean, that's not like revolutionary, but think about all the times that we might have kids in inclusive classrooms. There are lots of scenarios where you see the model get rewarded, but you're not going to. So it just kind of became an issue of something to think about how we might deal with, and yet another thing we would have to teach kids. Once we teach them to learn through observation, we then have to teach kind of the exceptions to those situations. But what was interesting is when we dropped that observed reinforcement condition. So now that it's either the dark circles in this phase 2 are observed and direct reinforcement, the triangles are video modeling only, and then we see much more organized responding. So for the first 2 kids, they do what we would expect. They perform the behavior when it leads preferred consequences. They don't when it doesn't. For the third kid, initially we see that, but then eventually he just starts imitating across every session. And I call it imitation here because I think that's exactly what it was. Basically, he had a generalized imitative repertoire. So he would perform the behaviors whether they were reinforced or not, and with kind of these tangible items. So it was under more of a social reinforcement situation. Implications, what was interesting and what I've gone back to question is what actually would typical children do when presented with the same series of events. And we can actually go do this with my youngest daughter like tomorrow. I should, but it wouldn't really be research in that case, or probably ethical, so I haven't, but I kind of want to. Because I'm not sure how typical children would respond. So if you go back all the way to Bandura's studies, his studies would suggest that they would suppress responding, but none of those studies looked at within subject variability, just across subject variability. So they never had the confound of seeing both the model rewarded and the model punished and the model receive neutral or no reinforcement. And all participants, though, did eventually perform as expected. So again, it just goes back to the idea that kids with autism, they do have observational learning repertoires, even though we might not see them in most situations. So figuring out conditions under which we're more likely to see them engage in observational learning. But then the bigger problem goes back to trying to figure out that first instance. How do we capture that first instance? When does it occur? We know it occurs around 10-ish months for typical kids. When does it occur for kids with autism? Perhaps at the same time. So now we're trying to figure out a methodology. I say for teaching, it should say for assessing. We really need to assess an observational learning repertoire. So have some kind of a measurement system, and I'm thinking that this is a behavioral assessment to identify when that repertoire is or isn't absent, is present or absent. And then if it is absent, what interventions lead to acquisition of the repertoire and not just specific social skills. And then a series of studies to kind of test that methodology and evaluate with more of a randomized trial. That's it.
What were the, in that last alternating design, was it just the video that discriminated the conditions, or were there other?
No, well, part of that is tricky. We did use big, giant pieces of construction paper to try and get them to attend to it. And so every condition was paired with either red, yellow, or blue. And then the kid, when it was time for a session, an experimenter would go up to the kid with the red paper, have them take the red paper, go and stick it on the giant red, so a small red square they put on the giant red paper. We're just trying to get them to see it, to see if they can discriminate between the conditions. And they couldn't. They didn't discriminate either the video or the pictures. I mean, we didn't look more carefully at whether or not the colors did anything. So all we can really infer is that they didn't discriminate between the video modeling. But eventually they should have, right? Because they're in one session, and that entire session is dedicated to one type of instruction. So they should have figured out pretty quickly that, oh, yeah, this isn't getting reinforcement, or this is getting reinforcement. I'm going to engage in the behavior, and they didn't. So that, again, raises the question, what would a typical child do? Some of that data we actually have from some of the experiments in the 1970s, but they didn't go necessarily as young as 3- and 4-year-olds, and that probably requires some replication.
I have another one.
Yeah.
If they're not discriminating, do you think there's like schedule effects for observational learning? So like some of the time they're getting, it's like almost like intermittent reinforcement in the observation session, and that's why they're performing the same across all of them? Like, I wonder if it has to be every time that they see the model that they get reinforced, that they would perform that, or can someone just get it some of the time and they observe it some of the time and they still do it?
Right. That's what. So that's part of where this came from. Is that prior research with typically developing children showed that eventually that did work, but then eventually the response faded and you wouldn't get it. And so what we were looking at then in this condition really was the response should have occurred in the direct reinforcement and the observed reinforcement conditions. It really should have happened in both because they were learning across both. Although we should have seen maybe some evidence of it weakening over a session, and we didn't see that either. But then it shouldn't happen at all in the video modeling only condition. So we just present behavior. We shouldn't see any responding. So that was really the control to show that, yeah, they're learning, observational learning really is in effect here.
So I'm curious about your thoughts on the video aspect of it, which is, I mean, it's obviously a really nice way to present it.
Right.
But in terms of seeing kids in the real world settings, they may not demonstrate observational learning when they do in these sort of task-based situations because the context is different. And I'm curious as to whether or not you think the video component is part of the key to them being able to perform these tasks.
Yes.
And can you, I'm just curious if you...
So it's a big problem because doing this in a real environment is really, really difficult because what they observe, it's very difficult to control what they observe. We have no idea what kids observe in the real environment. And so when we can control it with like this boxed device, it really helps increase the likelihood they're attending to what we want them to see. So I think the video makes a huge difference in performance in the environments. One of the questions I have is actually if we had a kid who didn't have an observational learning repertoire. So if we set up a series of probes in the real environment, say 10 different events where another child is reinforced for engaging in some kind of relatively salient behavior, does a child with autism engage in that behavior or not? And oftentimes they don't. We see it in environments all over and over again. But then if you started teaching them to attend to video models, like lots of different types of video models, so think about a multiple exemplar process, and also embedding maybe some of the typical peers in their setting into those videos, would that lead eventually to observational learning in the real world environment? So that's one question I have, is could you exploit that benefit of the video for purposes of teaching in the real world?
So I was actually wondering in the study where we're kind of proposing sort of like why the order effects of the observational learning piece might affect learning. So even if you show the child ahead of time what's going to happen and then they get a chance versus you're prompting in the moment. I almost wonder, and I couldn't figure out in this brief thought about it, I can't figure out how you would actually do prompting within the moment on video, but I almost wonder if you had them both on video, whether or not it would increase responding, like if you actually did the prompt by a video.
Right.
So is it ordering effects and seeing the whole sequence, or is it seeing it on video?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, would they imitate the video if they just saw it really quickly? Most of the data from other studies suggests they don't just imitate the video very often, at least early learners. So this kid on the bottom did, and we do see kids who have better overall learning skills do imitate videos, but probably because they have a generalized imitative repertoire, and they'll just imitate almost anything. Kids that don't, though, we're seeing better effects when they observe preferred consequences. But that's a good question, too, to tease apart.
And it's interesting because going back to like some of the stuff on sort of just even like live versus video modeling, where you're literally just doing the same exact behavior side by side. Kids with ASD are better at video modeling. So like that's where you're not changing anything other than just the presentation style. And so that comes back to sort of like, what is it about the video modeling that seems to add the added benefit? Is it just sort of novelty or interest, or is it reduced cues? Is it helping focus their attention on relevant information? Right.
That's part of the, part of the challenge is you just don't know what they're attending to in the live model. Whereas in the video, you control all of the inputs. So you limit what's in there, or you restrict it again to a box. So if they're oriented toward a video and then they imitate, you can assume that they're watching the correct things in the video. But in real life, orienting isn't enough. Like, it's Google Glass.
Right.
Where are they actually looking and attending to, and for how long? Because it's almost impossible to figure out where kids are actually looking. You can get orienting data, but we can't get where are they focused, and for how long do they focus in one spot.
You have to use eye tracking.
Yes.
Yeah.
But can you do that live? If you're looking
use-
at a
there's-
video
you have
or
to
screen,
use
right?
Glasses.
You can
Google
use
Glass.
mobile eye. Yeah,
Oh, can you?
there's a mobile eye. But again, will the kids tolerate it?
Yeah.
All of that kind of, they'd have to get used to having it on, maybe.
So then what does the mastery phase look like when you're measuring that? Are you still showing them the video? How are you measuring the mastery of this?
So usually acquisition is showing the video and they perform at a high rate, and then for mastery we would have faded out the video.
So they're still doing, you still have evidence they're learning.
That they sustained, that they learned the behavior,
Okay.
and that now it's, now they're performing it under conditions where the model isn't shown. That first kid, the video that had nothing to do really with observational learning, was just a demonstration of, over time we can fade out the video and we still get the response.
Even if it can't be taught live, it could be a long-term skill for kids.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The big one, for me, like my interest at this point is really trying to figure out this question around how do you demonstrate observational learning? Well, how do you demonstrate the absence of it and be certain that it's a valid assessment? And then how do you demonstrate that it has occurred? Well, and how do you induce it? Because we don't really have interventions that would work for it. So there is a team working on things like conditional discrimination training, delayed match to sample, imitation training, discriminating consequences. So they actually teach kids to discriminate consequences. And the general idea is with most behavioral interventions is teach all of these in these like component steps and then continue to test for observational learning because it's likely to happen. And I think at some point that probably is the case. Whether it happens the way it should, right? That they can pull the cord on the bus when they need to, or that they can, get through airport security just like the person in front of them when they need to. I don't know if that really occurs, but that's kind of where we are right now with observational learning interventions for kids with autism. There isn't much. So if you have ideas, let me know.
So people are like using just sort of general, like vicarious reinforcement and punishment and teaching them to discriminate between that, even for like known behavior or for behaviors that are already in their repertoire?
Yes. Yeah. So can we alter responding?
Yeah.
Right. So and that's actually a pretty decent demonstration of the effects of consequences of observed consequences, because you can turn the behavior on and off simply based on the consequences that are observed. And yeah, there's a group in on the East Coast doing quite a bit of research in that area. Doug Greer is doing work on conditioning for teaching kids to creating conditioned reinforcers through observation. So if you pair a token with a preferred item, observationally, can the token become a preferred item for the child? And with typical kids, it turns out the answer is yes, that you can make a piece of string a reinforcer just because they see somebody else get a piece of string for something. But the evidence for kids with autism is less clear.
I guess I've always sort of struggled with this idea of whether or not it is like a foundational deficit or is it a performance deficit?
Mm-hmm.
And like even with imitation, because you have all these things on imitation that show kids with autism have imitation deficits, but yet they don't sometimes. And so it depends on what the study is. And I'm just thinking like your study and intention understanding. I mean, there was no difference in behavioral reenactment paradigm, was there? Between the kids with ASD and the typically developing kids, which is using an imitation-based model. And so in a lot of cases, you don't see them when the tasks are highly salient, highly controlled. And so I always wonder, is there something like they don't have it, or that they totally have it, but the environmental consequences and reinforcement and social and all of those other things just don't promote them to use it?
So we've been talking about this a ton at Eli lately because we have a chance to like watch kids in a variety of situations. And we'll identify kids as they do not have an imitative repertoire. They definitely don't have a generalized imitative repertoire. So that's how we'll code their BB maps. We can move on. Great. Then all of a sudden, this kid who doesn't imitate like ever, we show a video. It's like a song with head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Great. Everyone does it. He doesn't because he doesn't have an imitative repertoire. So no problem there. The video's over. A minute later, the kid's standing in front of the TV doing it raises some questions about how we define imitation, because I would say that's a stronger imitative response than even highly controlled generalized imitation. So then what do you do?
Right. No, I know. It's a conundrum.
Yeah. And I think observational learning is the same thing, that a kid might not do what we want them to do under our experimental conditions, but when they see an older brother or sister climb on a counter and get the Halloween candy, they can't climb on the counter, but they can push a chair over to the counter, climb up the chair, climb on the counter, and get the Halloween candy. And, they're like these quote-unquote severely delayed learners, except they learned that really quick.
Right.
That's where the assessment piece comes in, is getting a valid assessment of imitation and observational learning. But I think you could make the argument for the reliability of the response in some way, that if it's only under these highly, highly specific conditions, that it's not a very reliable overall response. So it's probably not that useful.
I've always wondered, like, whether or not you could do it by manipulating the complexity of the scene to see, I mean, that would be something you do.
Right.
We tried to do this and it didn't work, so I should really recommend doing this, but we tried to do this where we were doing just like a basic video modeling paradigm, trying to elicit just basic imitation, not necessarily observational learning. And we had it like where it was a close-up on the adult doing the modeling versus a further back with other stuff that might be potentially interesting. And I'm just curious, like, if you compared kids with ASD to typically developing kids, where, like, as if you had these situations happening even like on video in more complex scenes where there are multiple things going on, and then you could actually eye track, because you're doing a video, to see whether or not typically developing kids are just picking it up among more complex things.
When I think that is, I mean, I go back. I don't think there has been much replication of like the original Bandura's original observational learning studies. I don't think that they've had much replication. There has been a lot of, at least that I know of. They certainly haven't been replicated with a within subjects design, which I think is helpful to know, because then you really see if you can turn it on and off within an individual. It's helpful to know that. So that's where I would see an important kind of research area is more with typical kids.
I was just going to say, Eli seems like a really great place to answer these questions.
Convenient.
Convenient.